of the legend, the GOAT, as you may say.
You know, the real depth that he had as an individual.
Yeah, very ahead of his time, wasn't he?
He impacted me and he impacted the world.
I'd actually forgotten it had such an impact on me when I was at school.
You know, he's a good guy, and he knows the implications or the impact of what he's just done.
Oh, hello there. I'm Jimmy Shuker, alongside Albert Chalmers and Sean Goodman, and this is Radiant Light, episode 28, the Bruce Lee Special.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Radiant Light podcast. Don't forget to give us a like or a subscribe. Albert, Sean, welcome today. We're discussing Bruce Lee.
This one I'm really excited for. As you know, I'm a huge fan of the man we're about to speak of, the legend, the GOAT, as you may say.
Well, we're all huge fans of Bruce Lee here, very much the GOAT of martial arts. I know you especially, Albert. Let's get straight into this. Why is Bruce Lee so important to us personally?
Bruce Lee is important to me personally because he has been an inspirational individual role model for me throughout my life. My understanding of him has certainly evolved over the years. So when I was a kid, I remember going to Blockbuster. I would always go to the martial arts section. I kept going back, and my dad and I kept renting Bruce Lee movies. And one of my favorites, which we can talk more about later, is Enter the Dragon. I actually have my old, when I was cleaning out at my parents' house, I found my old DVD, not even a Blu-ray, but my old DVD of Enter the Dragon, which I recently rewatched. So when I was a kid, I loved him for the action. I thought it was really cool. I enjoyed, his films and subsequent martial artists who were influenced by him, like Jackie Chan and Jet Li. And then later, when I was a teenager and I started getting into martial arts, I also saw him as an inspiration, for developing my own practice there. And now recently, returning to him and returning to his life and ideas, I've also started to reflect more upon, the real depth that he had as an individual and his contributions to, spreading Eastern philosophy, or playing at least a small role in that, spreading it in the West, and his thoughts and reflections and writings on Taoism and Zen. And so I think that he's an interesting person because he wasn't just he didn't just fit into one box. He wasn't just an action star or a martial artist. So I think that he has, he made meaningful contributions to a lot of different areas, which I continue to go back to even to the present day. And I like to explore new aspects of him. And I feel like he's someone that you can keep returning to and constantly, be learning something new about.
Yeah, very ahead of his time, wasn't he?
I think he still is, to be honest. We're still catching up.
Yeah, you mean in terms of how he's like taking different philosophies from the East and West, presumably?
Well, he's very much a product of the 60s, but he's very much timeless at the same time. That's just how I feel about it. But my personal connection to Bruce Lee kind of goes right back to when my dad was first telling me about him. I still remember he was kind of imitating his stance and doing some of his the feinting he would do with his hands, sort of like Tai Chi type movements. And obviously my dad, not a Kung Fu martial artist or anything, but he was a huge fan, having seen his films in the 70s. So I was kind of a little curious. Then my dad later showed me a film called A Warrior's Journey, which has all the unseen footage from the Game of Death sequences at the end of the film, where he fights Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Dan Inosanto. And then finding out that each of those fights had a philosophical meaning behind it, and then just kind of like planting that seed in my mind. And then fast forward later when I'm like 20, 21, and I start getting into UFC, MMA, and watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, started getting into the more internal martial arts as well. Then I was like, okay, hold on a sec. I got to go back. I picked up a copy of the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. Kind of a little funny story. They sent it to the library instead of my house. So the library got a copy of the book as well. So in a way, I was like spreading maybe someone picked that up. You never know, right? But the philosophies that I found, I remember opening it to the first page and there was an illustration of a Taoist monk. And I thought, this Taoist stuff is starting to like creep into my mind. And just the way he writes, it is very Taoist and it is very profound. And then there's the practical stuff as well, how he was mixing judo, Muay Thai at a time when I don't think anyone was ever doing that. Now we have UFC and everything, so we take it for granted. But he broke down those barriers that were in martial arts, but in also just society at large. Very much when I say he's the GOAT, I know the GOAT could also be Muhammad Ali, but I think they both represent the same sort of thing, but for different minorities. Whereas Muhammad Ali broke down a lot of barriers for the African American community. We also have Bruce Lee doing the same for the Asian American community. So he did bridge the gap for the Eastern martial arts and the Eastern philosophy to seep in to the United States and the world at large. So he impacted me and he impacted the world. And that's why we're on what just happened was his 50th anniversary of his death. So we're kind of like, I think this is a good memorial to him.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Stay with us all the way until the end of this episode, where we've got an exclusive preview of what's coming up next time on Radiant Light.
I mean, for me, like, I just remember Bruce Lee being such a huge inspiration during my karate days. Don't know if you recall, I spoke on a previous episode where I was doing karate for a couple of years. You know, I got all the way up to brown belt, and at the time I was watching Into the Dragon as well and Way of the Dragon. There's one scene in particular from Enter the Dragon that I'd actually forgotten had such an impact on me when I was at school. And when we rewatched Enter the Dragon recently, I was like, oh my God, there it is. You know, it's this movie does where it's pretty sick. You know, he jumps up high into the air and just full blown double foot stomps this guy on the face. And basically it brought this memory back to me from my childhood where I was getting like picked on a little bit. I wouldn't say bullied or whatever, but these three guys were like giving me a bit of a rough time. And the smallest guy in the group, they were saying, oh, yeah, he could have you in a fight. He could have you in a fight. You know, yeah, that was it. Like they was having a pop at the karate thing. You know, they was being a bit disrespectful. Oh, you do karate. You think you can fight. No, you can't. Yada, yada, yada. And they're telling me that this like little punk could have me in a fight. And I'm just thinking, no, he couldn't. And anyway, like it gets agreed, oh, yeah, we're going to fight in the school playground, like as an organized thing. And the other two guys stood back and I got the guy on the floor pretty quickly. And yeah, I just remember jumping up in the air and just full on 2-footed stomping him in the face and really fucking hurt the guy. And yeah, after rewatching Into the Dragon, it was like, oh my God, yeah, like you took that straight out of Bruce Lee's playbook. Wow. So clearly it was an inspiration to me.
Yeah, that
it's
is
ironic.
That is a really emotionally charged scene, though, because that character that he does that to had in the film, he attacks Bruce Lee's sister, and then his sister ends up killing herself rather than being captured or perhaps something worse by this gang. And so yeah, it's a pretty powerful scene. She ends up killing herself, and then so this is the moment where Bruce Lee's getting that revenge for his sister, and it's a quite a powerful shot, right? Because it really shows he jumps and he stomps the guy, but it doesn't really focus on the guy he's killed. It really focuses on his face. And I remember actually watching that scene with my dad when I was a kid, and Bruce Lee is like looks really, there's like just all this emotion on his face. Like he's quite a good actor. Again, it's a shame
really
that
charged.
yeah, it's a shame that he died before he really got to see his full acting potential. But yeah, this like this really charged look. And I remember asking my dad, like, oh, why does he look so upset? Like, I was thinking like, oh, it's a kung fu movie. The bad guys are supposed to die. Like, why is he so upset? And I remember my dad being like, no, well, he's just like, he's just killed a man. Like this is, not something you take lightly. Like he's a good guy, and he knows the implications or the impact of what he's just done. And so even though he had to do it, like he's not taking any joy in killing someone. And I remember, having this discussion with my dad and thinking like, wow, it kind of changed my perception a little bit. Cause like I said, prior to that, I was just, guys getting killed left, right, and center. And it's just, the character doesn't have any emotional reaction to that. It's just, oh, this is what the good guys do in a movie. They just go around killing the bad guys. But I think that was one of the interesting things in that film as well, too, is that even though he's getting revenge for his sister, you don't see any joy. You see like this wave of rage go through his face, but then you see this sort of like this sadness too. Like he looks like he's gonna cry in that moment, and then he recollects himself, and then he returns to Han to like bow that the fight is over. And so I do think that's a really powerful scene. And I was actually, when I was watching my DVD here, this is something I miss about DVDs. Like streaming is great. You've got like a million choices at your fingertips, but they don't give you all the special features. They don't give you all the behind the scenes. And in here, the first disc is the movie, and the second disc is the special features. And in it, they were, interviewing different people. They were talking about the filming of the movie. And the actor, I can't recall his name, but the actor who played the villain, the foreigner guy with the beard that had caused Bruce Lee's sister's death, right before in that scene, before Bruce Lee stomps him, he kind of dishonors himself, right? Like he's losing the fight, so he picks up these two bottles and he smashes them, and he comes at Bruce Lee, and then that's when Bruce Lee kills him. But he had actually broken these bottles. And during that scene, he accidentally cut Bruce Lee. And then in the subsequent, filming of it, when Bruce Lee was doing his kick and he kicks the guy and the guy falls over, one of like the extras like dislocated their shoulder. And so actually like multiple people, Bruce Lee, that actor, and like an extra all got like injured during this scene, which again shows just how intense some of the filming was. Like, this is not like today, it's not all special effects. Like, of course, there's, tricks they do with the camera, like he's not kicking people every time, but, you got to understand that the filming of this was like, quite raw, and a lot of people were actually injured as a result, just because of all the stunts that they were doing.
Including Jackie Chan, too.
Yeah.
I love the way they're all men of honor as well in these scenes. Like, there's the scene where he has a showdown. I think it's with Han, spoiler alert. And he just says, "You have offended my family and you have offended the Shaolin Temple." And it's like, yeah, nice.
Mm-hmm. And that final scene too is it's just masterfully done. Like it said in the DVD I was watching, I think they used something like 5,000 or 10,000 mirrors. Like it took them like 2 days to set up like hours and hours to set up all these mirrors. And it's just a beautifully shot sequence. And it's just got like lots of like layers of symbolism in it too, right? The fact that he's like smashing the image of Han, and that like Han is like this character that hides behind like illusions and shadows, and Bruce Lee's like cracking that image to really just get to the reality of the situation, like breaking that illusion so he can defeat his enemy. Like it's there's a lot of layers of symbolism too. So I think that's again a reason why I keep coming back to this film, is because there's just so many layers to it. And as it's not a film, some films you watch and you get older, you're like, oh, okay, this was fun, but it's kind of stupid. I'm going to put this aside. I'm going to put this in my past. But his films, I keep, returning to them. And I feel like at different stages of my life, I can appreciate different layers or elements of his cinema.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of symbolism in that movie. Like I'm seeing it throughout. You mentioned the smashing of the windows, the mirrors, sorry. That's connected to the Zen proverb he talks about right at the beginning, right? Where he says,
remember, the enemy has only images and illusions, behind which he hides his true motives. Destroy the image, and you will break the enemy.
Another good one, Albert and I have spoken about this a couple of times, is I like the scene where he's talking to this kind of like British, clearly alcoholic guy who's offering him the alcohol. And he just casually says, no, thank you. And, the English guy carries on talking, blah, 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 and then he offers him another drink. Like he re-offers him the alcohol. And Bruce Lee just casually goes, no, thank you. And I don't know, it was a small moment in the movie, but like I really took something from that. I felt like it demonstrates that we don't actually have to explain ourselves. Like, for example, when I've got like the nosy neighbor talking to me about how I've got to replace my roof at home, yada, yada, yada. And I'm just kind of saying, well, personal finances, blah, blah, blah. I'm like just inviting him to come back at me with, well, but it's going to cost you more in the long run if you don't do it now. And just like, as if I have to justify myself. I should just Bruce Lee him. No, thank you. You understand what I mean?
For sure. Yeah. And I like that too. It helps to cultivate his image in the film as being this really, straight edge, like morally upstanding character. Another
He's the only silent monk who's allowed to have long hair too.
Another interaction I really like too, which again I think gets at some of the more philosophical elements of Bruce Lee's style and philosophy of martial arts, is when there's this New Zealand martial artist on the boat, and he's kind of a bully, and he like trips a guy that's carrying some oranges or something. He's just trying to look all tough. And then he goes up to Bruce Lee and he's like, what's your style? And Bruce Lee says, the art of fighting without fighting. And he's like, show me. He's like, well, there's not enough space here. We got to let's row out to that island and I'll show you on the beach. And the guy's like, okay. And he gets in the boat, and then Bruce Lee just comes up and then pushes the boat out. So the guy's being kind of like dragged behind, and like, it's really like embarrassing. And but it shows too that, this sort of alternate path where if you don't have to be violent, take that route. Or try to be creative, try to be, thinking outside the box in terms of how you can solve a problem, whether it's combat or otherwise.
Yeah, in that moment, Bruce Lee has clearly used his mind to just totally matrix the guy without any violence whatsoever, to just make a complete fool in front of himself and put the guy into a really vulnerable situation. In harm's way without raising a finger,
Yeah, it's like an extension of the internal martial arts. It's almost like a Tai Chi move, but in a more theatrical kind of way. Mm-hmm. But I also like that the first time you watch it, it kind of plays off like it's a James Bond movie. But then you realize that every martial arts movie after was a ripoff of that movie. Like the martial arts tournament, you play Street Fighter, you play Mortal Kombat, you watch Bloodsport. I mean, even the UFC, really, because in the beginning of the film, he's fighting Sammo Hung's character at the Shaolin Temple, and they're using like his original Jeet Kune Do glove, which is like a hybrid martial art glove, basically the first mixed martial arts fight in a film. So it is like more influential than you would even think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
you mentioned Street Fighter there, but I could have sworn in Mortal Kombat, Liu Kang is basically Bruce Lee.
100%.
It's every game, every movie, like literally in Street Fighter 2 and Tekken, they both have Bruce Lee type characters that almost resemble them identically. They just have a different name.
You know, it's funny too, because I was recently I was watching the Mortal Kombat film from the 90s, which is I don't know. I'm not gonna say it's fun. It's got some fun moments, but it's kind of a bad movie, I would say. And as I was rewatching Enter the Dragon recently, I just realized how many tropes were taken from Bruce Lee and from Enter the Dragon. So there's there is the tournament, of course. There is the fact that there is a Bruce Lee-like character, but even some of the other characters too, like Johnny Cage is an actor. And in the movie, it's a joke because he shows up with all these suitcases. He's like this, rich guy. He's got like, sort of dressed up really nicely. He's got all these like suitcases. He's bringing like 15 bags with him or something. In Enter the Dragon, the one character, like the American, I think he's like a businessman. It's sort of the same joke that he shows up and he's got like 15 suitcases with him. And one of the characters says, "Oh, you haven't changed at all, have you? Always traveling in style." Says something like that to them. So there was that element which was copied. And the more I was watching it, I'm like, wow, definitely, Mortal Kombat was heavily inspired, probably even to the point of plagiarizing Enter the Dragon.
Wow.
I think that martial arts is an industry where plagiarism is more accepted than the average.
Yeah.
It just seems like we all accept it at this point, and we almost like demand it. I'm not buying it unless it's exactly like the other 15 Mortal Kombat games in the series or whatever. Which is good and bad. I think in a way, Enter the Dragon is so prolific that it's kind of held back the industry as well, in a sense, because we're like almost afraid to go beyond it. Whereas Bruce Lee's whole philosophy was that he should just start this trend and then we should like carry it on. And I think MMA has done that, at least more so than the film industry. But that's up for debate, I suppose. And I think I was just going to say one thing about the plot of the film is that it does seem like a little bit like a funny movie, but then you have like the scene where they try to arrest Jim Kelly's character for just being a black dude with a passport, basically. And they're, why do you need a passport? We're just going to arrest you. Like that kind of stuff obviously wasn't inspired by fiction. That was inspired by things that were happening on the ground level. And I wonder too, if there was more to Hans Island, like it seems very Epstein-esque.
And this is Radiant Light, where we drop the red pill shit. You can even follow us on Instagram, radiant_light_podcast.
And I'm kind of like, I reach for like conspiracies because that's just my mind, but I feel like maybe he was opening a can of worms in that sense. It's hard to say.
Well, I do really like how you mentioned the Jim Kelly's character, because like you can, when you're first introduced to him, you're at this karate dojo and it looks like it's being run by the Black Panthers or a similar kind of group. And then, like you said, there's the scene, the cops try to arrest him. They pull him over for no reason aside from just being a black man walking down the street with a suitcase. And then afterwards, there's a really good shot when they're getting onto the boat, and there's all the boat people. So like it was this sort of minority group in Hong Kong, which between the 1910s and about the 1980s or 1990, they lived in the Hong Kong harbor and they would live on the boats. And actually, this scene kind of put me down a bit of a rabbit hole. So I started looking into them, and then apparently they lived there till about the 80s, and then Hong Kong, the government had a relocation program to give them incentives to move on to the land and subsidized housing. So they kind of disappeared by about 1990 or so. But there's a really good shot, and it shows all the people on the boats, and there's a woman, she's got like a baby on her back, and like is like, you know, rowing the boat and ferrying them off to this you know, the ship that they're going to take to the island. And then Jim Kelly's character looks out at all the boats, and he says, I think he says, ghettos, they're the same everywhere in the world, and they all stink. And so I thought that was really powerful too, where again, as a child, I'm watching this film, I'm not thinking about these layers, but it's, again, going back to my earlier point, it's a film that I can keep returning to and noticing new things. And you can see, oh wow, Bruce Lee was actually, there's some social commentary in here about, you know, the, you know, poverty in America, poverty in Hong Kong. You know, there's certainly some social commentary, you know, interwoven into the themes of this film.
Yeah, Bruce Lee clearly was getting a message across about racism in general at like I'll say a relatively early period in time, like compared to we are now. You know, he was very woke in that moment. Like, for example, in Way of the Dragon, just the general way that he's being treated at the airport by all these like well-to-do white people. It's very much like getting a message across, and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, like, wow, was he really treated like this, like everywhere he went? You know, it hits you.
I think also this theme of inequality too is also present in his film Fist of Fury. Bruce Lee is it takes place, I believe, in Shanghai in like the 1920s or 30s, around there. And the film centers on Bruce Lee's teacher being poisoned and killed by like a rival martial arts school, which is run by the Japanese, which kind of has the aesthetic of like a karate or judo dojo. And in it does really touch upon, you know, discrimination against the Chinese. There's one quite famous scene where Bruce Lee wants to go into this compound, and then he sees a sign up on the wall that says no Chinese and no dogs allowed, which is actually historically accurate. There were signs like this in Shanghai because Shanghai had been divided up amongst the French and the British and the Japanese and the Germans, and different powers had sort of carved up their own quarters. And there was different rules based upon which part of the city you were in. If you were in the French part of the city or the Japanese part of the city, there was actually different laws, different police force. And these signs, that they existed. And so then in it, Bruce Lee is enraged, and, you know, he jumps up and he kicks the sign and breaks it in two. And there's a scene too where the Japanese come and they say, they're like, oh, we have a gift for your dojo, for your school. And they give it to Bruce Lee and his school, and it says like the sick man of Asia is written on it, which is what China was called at the time, you know, between, you know, the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was called the sick man of Asia because the Qing dynasty had been weak under the nationalist government too. China was pretty weak in the 20s and 30s. So you can definitely see this sort of nationalism at play in his films, but more nationalism, more in the sense that he's trying to show his Chinese pride and also trying to break some of these stereotypes that had been really present, both in, you know, Asia, both in terms of the way that Japanese people had perceived China. And you got to think too that Bruce Lee, he grew up when some of his earliest memories were, you know, living in Hong Kong under the Japanese occupation, right? Like he was a child in World War II. And, you know, he had been born in the United States, and he had, you know, returned back at a very poor time. Very shortly after they got back, Hong Kong was invaded right after Pearl Harbor, and it remained under Japanese occupation till the end of the war. And there's stories that Bruce Lee had actually, as a child, been, you know, really angered, and he would shake his fist in the air at the Japanese planes flying overhead. And so you have to think too that this must have been a real inspiration for him, right? These experiences living under the Japanese occupation. And so you see that come out in his art, both in terms of trying to, you know, dispel, you know, these myths about China, trying to fight against the way that the, you know, Japanese people perceive China, and also trying to dispel myths about, you know, about Chinese people and Asians and Asian Americans in the United States.
How old would Bruce Lee have been when this was going on?
He was born in 1940, and the occupation went on until late 1945. So he would have been, 4 or 5 years old, and so some of those would have been some of his earliest memories. Would have been living in Hong Kong under the Japanese occupation.
Yeah, that would have been really drummed into his consciousness. Yeah, no wonder he's like putting these messages out there through his art and through his movies. Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that with us. Albert, can you speak to any more adversity that Bruce Lee faced as an Asian man? Like, for example, when he broke into Hollywood in the 1970s?
I can think of two specific examples. First would be when he got the job on Green Hornet, and he was paid like 10% of what his co-star was paid, based on just purely the fact of his race, nothing else.
Wow, man, that's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the exact number, but you can see the pay stubs, and it's like very small percentage. Plus, the other one was the show Kung Fu. Apparently, he created the premise for that, and they just like took his script and cast a white guy instead because
David Carradine.
Yeah. No disrespect to Carradine or anything, but it's like that was clearly they just at that time they didn't have faith in lead actors except for white people, and if they had an Asian character like Charlie Chan, they would hire like a Swedish guy to play a Chinese guy. But it was always a caricature. It was always super racist and stereotypical to the point of being extremely offensive and marginalizing. And I think that just like that feedback loop of Asian people seeing themselves portrayed that way gave them less confidence and whatnot. It just basically got to the point of him leaving and going back to Hong Kong again in the 70s to make The Big Boss, which was his breakout film, right? But when he was doing Green Hornet, people loved it. It's just they just didn't care that people loved it. It was just their mind was so stuck on the way it was. He also got some really bad criticisms from his own community because there was a situation with Wong Jack. Do you remember his name, Sean? He had to fight martial artists.
Yeah, I remember his surname was Wong. I don't remember his full name, but yeah.
His name is Jack Wong or something now, but his original name I can't remember. But he was a martial artist from China who was also in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when Bruce Lee opened his school in Oakland, they were very against him teaching Caucasians because obviously the Caucasians hadn't been treating them very well. So they were like, these martial arts are our only thing that we have left to protect. We have to protect it. And Bruce Lee was like, no, I'll teach Caucasians and black people. And it doesn't really matter what your race, as long as you're interested in learning what he was teaching at that time, which was Jun Fan Gong Fu, his own system, which came from the Wing Chun that he learned from Ip Man back in Hong Kong when he was a youth. And he had these like rooftop street fights, and everybody knows those original street fights were kind of like preparing him for this big altercation that he had, where he, as the story goes, the dude started running because Bruce Lee tried to kick him in the nuts, and he just chased the guy around and then eventually jumped on him and just like beat him into a verbal submission, which earned him the right to teach Kung Fu in the United States. But it also created a lack of faith in his own style because he thought style in itself was too limiting. And then he started to work on Jeet Kune Do, which was a style without style, or as the quote is, using no limitation as limitation. I have the full quote. I gave you the full quote before the episode.
Yeah, I've got it here on my notes. You've got also using no way as a way and using no limitation as limitation. Tell us a bit more about this, Albert.
So Jeet Kune Do means the way of the intercepting fist. So the main principle is that it's a counter fighting system. So if I see you have the intention to attack me, I should intercept with a pre-eminent attack. So my attack should come before your attack, but I have to anticipate your attack in order to do that. But the philosophy is much deeper in that the style should be based on your own attributes and your own strengths, and you take what you know and you eliminate. There's the other quote I gave you, which is...
Yeah. Go on, you take it.
Let's see if I can recite it. It's absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and integrate what is uniquely your own. Something like that.
Yeah, you told me essentially your own, but yeah, it's same principle, isn't it? Yeah, elaborate a little bit more on this for us, please.
So basically in karate, for instance, you learn a set of kata, and then the kata, which is like forms, right? Like this block, this punch, that punch. You just learn those forms, and you're supposed to use those forms against someone else who uses the same forms. Whereas Jeet Kune Do is totally the opposite of that. It's like there is no form. You're like water, and you're just in the moment, and your movements should be from your inner being, sort of, is like the best way I can put it. Your personality should, like, kind of like a dance, but it's a deadly dance. Does that make sense? So when you're dancing, you don't want to just do the cha-cha. Like, he was a cha-cha dancer. But you don't want to just use the set of moves when you're dancing, because that will, like, there's the tango, right? Let's use that analogy. The tango has specific moves. You have to do those moves. So everyone's tango looks the same. And the more you try to, like, put yourself into your own flair, your own personality, the less like a tango it looks, the more like just improvised free dancing. So
yeah, so the tango being like the skeleton, the basic fundamentals, and then your personality being your own twist and putting it through your own personal funnel, right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, essentially. But I think Jeet Kune Do was just his style for himself, and he has his own stance that he liked. He had his own moves that he liked. But then, obviously, not everyone is his exact height and his exact attributes, right? So you should find something like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for instance, a very tall man, a lanky dude, a basketball player. He should be using moves that are totally different to Bruce Lee's. So his style shouldn't look this. He shouldn't try to fight like Bruce Lee. It would be foolish.
This is Radiant Light. You can always reach out to us at Radiant Light Podcast 1. That's the number 1 at gmail.com.
But again, I think this is what gives Bruce Lee a really unique perspective, is that, you know, he had lived in the United States, he lived in Hong Kong, he had gone back and forth, and I think it gave him a unique perspective, and he was able to take things from different styles, you know, not being married to one style. Of course, in his youth, most famously, like Albert mentioned, he studied Wing Chun, Kung Fu. But yeah, he did also learn boxing at this Catholic school that he went to. Then later, when he came to the United States, he was studying judo. Some of his students were judoka. Famous stuntman, Gene LaBelle, he became good friends with Bruce Lee. And so Bruce Lee had exposure to judo. Fencing as well. I believe one of his brothers was a fencer. I forget the exact connection with fencing, but I know that he also studied fencing and used it. You know, of course, Bruce Lee specialized in unarmed combat. I mean, he uses weapons in his films, but as a martial artist, he focused primarily on unarmed. I mean, you know, there was the staff, the nunchucks, but I think he took the footwork from fencing and tried to implement that into his practice.
Because it's all about the first strike, landing the first strike.
Yeah.
I like how he used Japanese martial arts too, even though he like made a living off of beating Japanese people up. he wasn't. I think that was like to represent what you said about them being oppressed by the Japanese and then like fighting back. But also he wasn't afraid to use what he knew worked from their styles and whatnot. He could see past it. He wasn't so,
Yeah. Well,
blinded by anger.
I think having the Japanese as a villain, that film, I think it was just I shouldn't say was, it was, and it still is a popular trope in Chinese cinema, is, this period of time. Just like today for us, even today, I don't think there's really any animosity, between North Americans or the British and Germans anymore, but it's still just a common trope, right? Where it's like sort of the go-to villain is, okay, we're going to have the Nazis are going to be the bad guys. It's kind of like that in Chinese cinema as well, where, the Japanese occupation and resisting the Japanese, it's just a common trope. So definitely he has some commentary in there about, the way Chinese people were treated. But I think it was more so just a backdrop for the film. I mean, yeah, like you said, he worked alongside, karate practitioners, judoka, and that was one of the, key elements of his martial arts philosophy as well, right? Is again, the, adopting what is useful, rejecting what is useless. And so I think that his whole philosophy, his style didn't have any national boundaries. And if he saw something as having utility, then he was going to adopt it.
Would it be fair to say that this fusion of martial arts that Bruce Lee was able to put together in his overall body of work is like his biggest legacy overall?
Yeah,
Possibly.
It's certainly one of them. Again, he has so many different legacies, right? I mean,
in terms of a fighting legacy, then if we just box it as say, if we just box this as say that the fighting department of what he's done and put together, it just feels like that really wasn't the done thing at this point in time, and now it is. So he was kind of like the pioneer, if I can present it to you that way.
Well, I think he was smart in that he used acting and film to spread it to more people, as opposed to like if he had just competed in martial arts tournaments, because then say he loses one martial arts tournament, then all that goes out the window. Instead, he did these demonstrations and 1-inch punch people across the room and everything, and people, whoa, whoa, whoa. Then he makes these movies and it reaches the masses, and you have like suburban teenagers all through the 70s and 80s going to karate, going to different martial arts, whereas that could have possibly never happened.
For sure. And that's why I like earlier, Albert, you were talking about perhaps him being the GOAT in martial arts. And I think a lot of times people really get fixated on this very narrow question of who would win in a fight, Bruce Lee or Muhammad Ali, or who would win? How would Bruce Lee do in the UFC today? But it's a pretty simplistic question, right? I think that we need to look at, again, like Jimmy said, he was a real pioneer at the time. He was the first one to really be, trying to bridge Eastern and Western martial arts. He was bringing philosophy into it. His whole, way of teaching and his way of adopting, what was useful was very unique for the time. And I think this would later resonate in the UFC. Of course, MMA today doesn't have the same kind of philosophical underpinnings that Jeet Kune Do did or does. So it's different in that regard. I mean, there's not the same sort of practice of mindfulness or Taoism in martial arts today that he was trying to implement, but the underlying theory of taking what's useful, rejecting the useless, I mean, that's very much become a part of MMA, right? And you can really see this, this trend really started after Bruce Lee. Not to say that he was the first one to do it. I mean, you do have, there were, going back to, Kano's time, there was, feuds between the judoka and those practicing the more traditional jujitsu. The Gracies in Brazil were doing challenges, into like the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Were challenging, judoka, catch wrestlers, challenging people from other styles. So it's not to say that Bruce Lee was necessarily the very first, but he was certainly a pioneer in that regard. And this sort of theory of, okay, we're going to take the groundwork from jiu-jitsu, we're going to take the throws from judo or wrestling, we're going to take the striking from this martial art, we're going to take this, this idea of taking the useful elements of different arts and putting them together. This really wouldn't become widely adopted or widespread until, the spread of, MMA, which, pinpointing the date might be difficult, but I would say it wasn't really popularized here until probably about the 90s, right? With UFC, the 90s, the early 2000s is when this sort of model became a lot more popular. So if you look at it that way, Bruce Lee is really like 20 or 30 years ahead of his time.
Yeah, Albert, didn't you say there was like a moment in time where just, I don't know, the mixing of the karate and the judo or whatever was just like no way would you get one against the other or something like that, and then it all changed after Bruce Lee?
Well, yeah, that's what I meant when I said he was a product of the 60s, because in the 60s, a lot of these barriers kind of started to dissolve, like New Age, mixing of different religions and spirituality, and, people of different races starting to intermarry. These kind of things were all happening at the same, it was part of the zeitgeist. So I see Jeet Kune Do as just like maybe the pinnacle of that style of thinking, perhaps. Obviously, that's coming from my point of view, which is a very Bruce Lee centric worldview. But I think honestly, without him, it's hard to imagine the United States adopting such a. I mean, he was married to a Caucasian woman. It wasn't seen as normal. He had to like trick her parents by having his white friend show up at their house and pick her up to go on dates. You know what I mean?
Wow, was it as bad as that?
Yeah, I mean, to put it into perspective as well, I think that that Albert brings up a really good point. I think that the anti miscegenation laws, so the laws against mixed race inter race marriages, or having mixed race children, a lot of states, like California was more liberal, but a lot of other states, especially in the deep south of the United States, interracial marriage was not legalized until I want to say 1967, I believe.
Not legalized.
Yeah. So in a lot of again, California was more liberal, but in other states, in Alabama or Georgia, Virginia, interracial marriages were illegal until the late 60s.
Wow. So Bruce Lee he's an artist. He's in a time when it wasn't the done thing. Not only is he fusioning, if that's a word, martial arts, he's like breaking down boundaries with his Zen philosophies and culturally. And let's talk a bit more about his Zen philosophy. Albert, speak to this a little bit, please.
Well, I mean, having grown up partially in Hong Kong, I guess he would have been exposed to their philosophies. I don't know per se if he ever identified as a Zen Buddhist, but we do see the quotes clearly inspired by Zen Buddhism. And he was also a fan of Jean Krishnamurti, who was an Indian philosopher during the 60s, who spoke about like actualization, human reaching like a higher level. And he took that out and embodied that to the fullest, because he was kind of like the peak physical, the peak mental, the peak spiritual. He took everything to its highest extreme, which could have been good and bad. I think living in extremes isn't necessarily Zen. That's where he kind of deviated, but also, who's more intense than the Shaolin monks, right? When we spoke about that, their physical is like high level, right? So I think he was kind of a modern twist to that, because he did have long hair and cool style. He did dabble in drugs and recreational things that we don't have to speak about, but he wasn't like a pure monk type dude. I wouldn't say he was like straight edge in any sense. He did have, sexual affairs and whatnot, but he's a real human being, and he took being a human being and made it fun again. Like being a human being in the 50s wasn't even fun. That's my opinion. I'll look at the 50s. I'll watch a 50s movie and be like, thank God for Bruce Lee and and the Beatles and those people who took the philosophy of the time and kind of like the color came back. And literally, even in film, color did come back in the 60s. So I'm seeing all of it as one package, and Bruce Lee is just like one of those people on that Mount Rushmore with the Beatles, Muhammad Ali, these people who like shook America to its core so that you could dabble in Christianity and Zen Buddhism and not be considered like a blasphemous person who deserved to die, or like there was a really dark way of thinking for a long, long time. Now I think we've gone too far the other way, in a sense where I think everyone wants you to be like so open-minded that you're like basically not allowed to stand for anything anymore. And I don't think Bruce Lee would have been about that, because he would have like died for certain things that he believed in. I see him as a very noble person, right? So
yeah, and I think getting into his philosophy, I think that you framed that really well. That this was a really, it's hard to overstate, how radically transformative the 1960s was, right? Like again, you mentioned, there's the time of the Beatles and counterculture and the hippies and
Well, can you paint us a bit of a before and after the picture here, Sean?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 1950s are oftentimes seen as more of a time of conformity. And again, this is not entirely true. There were the beatniks, there was, there's Jack Kerouac, there's On the Road, there's the rise of teen and youth culture. So society definitely was changing in the 1950s. You have the growth of the civil rights movement. So it's not to say that it was a time of strict conformity, but all these other kind of groups that I mentioned, they were much more marginalized in society. And there's this idea that the 1950s, to have a good life, you're supposed to have the white picket fence and 2 cars and the wife stays at home and you got 2 or 3 kids in the nuclear family and all that. Anyone that deviated from that was, again, quite marginalized.
Blasphemy,
pretty much. And then in the 1960s, this is where a lot of the counterculture begins to emerge. So again, you have more of the hippie movement, you have the Beatles, you have the anti-war movement, right? Where, the US is becoming increasingly involved in the Vietnam War. And you have this, student movement, anti-war movement, who is opposing that. It's a time where people are rejecting a lot of more traditional values, rejecting the values of their parents. It's a time too where it's this mixing of East and West. Again, not to say that there was no Eastern philosophy being spread in the West before this, but it was, again, just a very, very, very obscure topic that was not really discussed in the mainstream. Or if it was just more, it was, done in a very caricature-like way. Whereas in the 1960s, you see, like the Beatles travel to India. There's Indian, musicians and philosophers and thinkers and gurus coming to the United States. So there was a lot more of this. There's the hippie trail where hippies would go and they would travel over to India. You don't see this quite as much in China, but still there's a lot of more through Hong Kong, right? Because Hong Kong was still a British colony at this time. But you do start to see the rise of Hong Kong cinema, movies from Hong Kong starting to spread into the West. So again, it was a time that there was a lot of radical changes in society. And so it's just interesting too to situate Bruce Lee within that, So this was the environment in which Bruce Lee started to come into the public spotlight. It was during this very turbulent time where there was a lot of cultural changes that were happening, a lot of, I think a good word that we can use, which can also be applied to Bruce Lee's philosophy, is syncretism. And so this is, I know we've discussed this before, I believe in the Confucius episode, but syncretism is essentially the mixing of two or more ideas, religions, or traditions together. So this is a period of time, again, a lot of the hippies were looking towards Eastern philosophy. They were studying Buddhism. As well, we can make a connection here to our previous episode on mindfulness. So there was, people like, John Kabat-Zinn was studying under individuals like Han. Am I saying that right, Albert? I know you have a copy of his book. Yeah, Han.
It's not Han.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't quite recall how to pronounce his name, but I know that there was prominent, Buddhist monks, Buddhist philosophers who were coming to America. There was, different, Eastern, whether it was, Indian philosophies, Hinduism, Buddhism was sort of coming into the public consciousness into the United States. So Bruce Lee came into prominence during this very interesting time. And you can see that his philosophy does borrow from different traditions. And like Albert said earlier, I don't think it was, he was tied down. I don't think he put a label on himself under any one particular philosophical branch. But you can see a lot of influence from Buddhism in his work, Taoism as well. In fact, the book that was published posthumously, which was a group of eclectic group of his writings about Jeet Kune Do. It was called the Tao, or the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. And so we can see that he was certainly very influenced by Taoism as well.
I
so
don't think
that
he would have chose that title just because it's like the way of the intercepting way, or like the way of the intercepting fist doesn't actually translate what it is, but
yeah,
that's Do actually and Dao are the same.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never actually thought of that it is sort of repetitive. Yeah. I think it was Linda, his wife, is the one that chose the title. I know it was her.
Yeah, a white person chose that title for sure. But it's a good book, and I'll probably cut this part out, but you can just keep talking.
Sorry, Jimmy.
No, you should carry on. It's great.
Yeah, and so that's why today, as I mentioned earlier, I keep coming back to Bruce Lee, and at different stages of my life, I find different layers that I had not previously observed or been aware of. And as I continuously return to him, as a child, a teenager, an adult, I, continuously find and discover new things. And so in preparation for this episode, I picked up this book here, Be Water, My Friend, which is written by his daughter, Shannon Lee. And he had two children, more famously, Brandon Lee, who died during the 20 years after the death of his father. He died during the filming of The Crow. And so this was his one surviving child, Shannon. And she wrote this book about his teachings. And I saw it in the bookstore, and it just, as soon as I went into the bookstore with an open mind. I didn't have any idea of what I was looking for. I just said, you know what, I'm going to pick up a book on Bruce Lee, and this is going to be my reading for the weekend to prepare for the podcast. And I went into the bookstore, and as soon as I saw this, it just really stood out to me. I think just the name, the fact that it was written by his daughter, the artwork on the front, and it really spoke to me. So I picked up the book. And
the Matrix just shot it right out there into your reality. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But tell us about this book, please. Like, how are you finding it?
It was a good book. It wasn't quite what I expected, but it is quite a good book. So it actually mixes. It's not strictly about Bruce Lee. A lot of it is about Shannon as well and her story. And there's a lot of layers to it. It talks about, obviously it talks about her father and his philosophy, lessons that we could learn from it. It also tells her own story as well. She was 4 years old when her father died, and that was one of her earliest memories, was his funeral in Hong Kong, which something insane, like 10 10% or 20% of the city of Hong Kong showed up for it. Like the streets were just lined with hundreds of thousands of people. And so that was one of her earliest memories. And then, later the experience of her brother dying and always kind of living in her father's shadow and people trying to compare her to him. And so some part of it too is about her struggles. But I think that this book is actually, going back to our episode that we did on mindfulness, I think that this might be the perfect introduction to mindfulness that you could give to somebody.
Wow.
So again, if someone is really well versed in mindfulness, it might be a little bit simplistic for them. But I think that if you have a friend that is looking to explore mindfulness, this would be a really good starting point, especially if they're interested in martial arts or cinema, because really that's what she talks a lot about in the book, is how her father again tried. People remember him for a lot of things, for his films, his martial arts. But she said that, her father's greatest kind of superpower, if you will, was his hard work, his dedication, and also his self-reflection, right? And this, again, goes back to his concept of Jeet Kune Do, kind of rejecting, what is useless, adopting things that are useful. Well, he had the same idea in his personal life too, about reflecting on one's emotions, trying to let go of negative emotions, seeing fear of failure, seeing fear of whether it's failing at a project or sounding foolish in front of somebody, giving up this fear of failure, reflecting on one's own mental states. And I think in here too, I just want to open up the page here. There's some really, really great quotes in this book. But one that I thought was particularly interesting here was the metaphor of the oak and the bamboo. And so I suppose it comes from like an old proverb. But he has this quote here: "When a man is living, he is soft and pliable. When he is dead, he becomes rigid. Pliability is life, rigidity is death, whether we are speaking of the body, the mind, or the spirit. Be pliable." And then he uses the example too of the oak and the bamboo, so that an oak tree is much stronger than bamboo, but in a storm, if there's like a windstorm, a typhoon, the oak tree is going to be the first one to break because it's rigid. The force of the wind is going to push it over. It's going to be uprooted. So the bamboo in the same storm, the oak tree is going to be uprooted, but the bamboo is going to bend, but then it's going to return. It's going to survive because it's more flexible. And so that's what he talks about in here. Is there's a lot of references to older proverbs, sort of aphorisms, maxims from Taoism and from Buddhism, and talking about how one needs to be, flexible, adaptable, self-reflective, how people should, try to cultivate themselves as well, seeing life as a process, a never-ending process of enlightenment and self-development and progression, as opposed to seeing it as there being some sort of fixed endpoint. Once I get to this stage in life, it'll be better. If I could only do this, my life would be better. Instead, always taking kind of enjoyment in the journey and seeing life as a journey of self-discovery and self-cultivation. And so that's what I really liked about this book. And I think that this book would really, resonate with readers today. And not just this book, but hit some of his other, I'm sure there's other books on his writings as well, that modern readers could get a lot of meaning out of. But like I said, I think this would be a great starting point if somebody said, hey, what is mindfulness? And like, how can I try to practice this in my daily life? I would say this book would be a fantastic starting point. And Bruce Lee's quotes, they're very inspirational too.
Awesome. If you could just repeat the title and the author of the book one more time, just for our listeners and viewers, please, Sean.
Yeah, so it's Be Water, My Friend, The Teachings of Bruce Lee by Shannon Lee, his daughter.
Wow, there you go. Our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for hanging in with us for all this time throughout this episode. And clearly it's been well worth it because you've got an awesome book recommendation there from you, right from Sean today.
Next time on Radiant Light.
Hello, everybody. Sean here. In the next episode of Radiant Light, I will be joined by my good friend Sherry to discuss Spring Festival, also known in the West as Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year. This celebration, which follows the lunar solar calendar, is known as Chunjie in China, Sulal in Korea, Tet in Vietnam, and Sagansar in Mongolia. It is celebrated in many countries across East and Southeast Asia and by their communities worldwide. In our conversation, Sherry and I will discuss the holiday's traditions, its history, legends, and how Chinese people celebrated it in the past and how they celebrate it today in the present. Please tune in next time to learn more.
Okay, that appears to be all we have time for on today's episode. So until next time, absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is essentially your own. Namaste.